Tonight, we bring you a developing story from the very heart of American democracy. The United States government is staring down yet another funding crisis, and this time, the consequences are already being felt across the nation. After days of tense standoffs between Republicans and Democrats in Congress, federal funding has officially lapsed for multiple key departments, triggering a partial government shutdown that threatens to impact millions of American lives before the fiscal year has truly begun. This is not political theater. This is not speculation or worst-case scenario planning. This is happening right now in real time as federal employees wake up uncertain about their paychecks, as national parks prepare to close their gates, and as essential services scramble to maintain operations with skeleton crews. For the second time in less than 12 months, lawmakers in Washington have failed to pass the comprehensive federal funding legislation needed to keep the entire government fully operational. The pattern is becoming disturbingly familiar, yet each shutdown carries its own unique political dynamics, its own human costs, and its own implications for how America governs itself in an era of deep partisan division. Over this past weekend, as most Americans were enjoying their time with family and friends, funding officially expired for several critical federal agencies: the Pentagon, tasked with defending the nation; the Department of Transportation, responsible for keeping America moving; the Department of Homeland Security, charged with protecting our borders and enforcing immigration law. These are not peripheral agencies dealing with minor administrative tasks. These are fundamental pillars of federal governance, and they are now operating in crisis mode. The immediate cause is straightforward. The House of Representatives and the Senate could not agree on how to finalize the federal budget. But as is often the case in Washington, the surface explanation only tells part of the story. Beneath the procedural breakdown lies a deeper struggle over policy, power, and the future direction of immigration enforcement in America. While the Senate managed to pass a bipartisan funding package earlier in the week that would keep most government functions operational, the House has yet to approve it. Speaker Mike Johnson has publicly stated that the shutdown will be short-lived and can be resolved quickly. But significant, substantive disagreements remain, particularly over funding for the Department of Homeland Security and the broader framework of immigration enforcement. Behind closed doors, negotiations continue. In public statements, both parties express optimism while simultaneously drawing hard lines in the sand. And in the meantime, the machinery of government grinds to a halt, one department at a time. To truly understand the current crisis, we need to examine what sits at the center of this political standoff. And that center is immigration policy, one of the most divisive and emotionally charged issues in American politics today. Earlier this week, the Senate and the White House reached what they described as a carefully negotiated compromise. The deal would provide full funding for most federal agencies and departments, allowing them to continue normal operations without interruption. However, there was one critical exception. The Department of Homeland Security would receive only a short-term funding extension of just 2 weeks. This is no arbitrary time frame. DHS oversees some of the most politically contentious functions of the federal government, including immigration and customs enforcement, customs and border protection, and the broader apparatus of border security. By limiting DHS to a 2-week extension, senators were effectively saying that they wanted more time to negotiate the terms under which these agencies would operate going forward. But Democrats, led by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, are demanding far more than just additional time. They are insisting on significant, substantive reforms to immigration enforcement policy as a condition for their support of any long-term DHS funding package. These reform demands are specific and far-reaching. They include requiring all immigration enforcement agents to wear body cameras during operations, a measure proponents say would increase transparency and accountability. They call for prohibiting agents from wearing face masks during certain enforcement actions, arguing that anonymity can lead to abuses of power. Perhaps most controversially, they demand that immigration authorities obtain judicial warrants before conducting certain types of home raids, rather than relying on administrative warrants issued by immigration officials themselves. For Democrats and immigrant rights advocates, these reforms represent basic civil liberties protections and common-sense oversight measures that should have been implemented years ago. They point to documented cases of mistaken identity raids, allegations of excessive force, and concerns about due process violations in immigration enforcement. But for Republicans, including Speaker Johnson and many House conservatives, these demands are seen as unacceptable constraints on federal law enforcement authority. They argue that such reforms would hamstring immigration agents in the field, make enforcement operations slower and less effective, and ultimately undermine the government's ability to enforce immigration law and secure the border. Speaker Johnson has been particularly vocal, calling the Democratic demands untenable and warning that accepting such conditions would set a dangerous precedent that risks further erosion of federal authority. He has characterized the situation as Democrats holding essential government funding hostage to advance a partisan immigration agenda. This policy fight over immigration enforcement and civil liberties has become so entrenched, so politically fraught, that it has effectively derailed the entire budget process. What should be a routine exercise in fiscal governance has instead become a high-stakes negotiation over fundamental questions of law enforcement, constitutional rights, and the balance between security and liberty. The result is what we see today: a partial government shutdown with no clear path forward, and both sides dug in for what could be a protracted fight. For many Americans watching this unfold, a natural question arises. How does the United States government actually run out of money? And why does this keep happening? The answer lies in a fundamental principle of American constitutional governance. The power of the purse belongs to Congress. The executive branch, including the president and all federal agencies, cannot spend a single dollar without congressional authorization. This is by design, a crucial check on executive power enshrined in the Constitution itself. Each fiscal year, which begins on October 1st, Congress is supposed to pass 12 separate appropriations bills that together fund the entire federal government. These bills cover everything from defense spending to education programs, from national parks to veterans' health care, from NASA to food safety inspections. When Congress fails to pass these funding bills, or when it cannot agree on a temporary measure called a continuing resolution, federal agencies lose their legal authority to obligate and spend money on ongoing operations. This is where a law called the Anti-Deficiency Act comes into play. The Anti-Deficiency Act, passed in the late 19th century and strengthened over the decades, explicitly prohibits federal agencies from spending or even obligating funds without proper congressional appropriations. Violating this law can result in serious penalties, including potential criminal prosecution for federal officials. So when funding lapses, agencies have no choice but to stop non-essential operations immediately. But here's the critical nuance. A government shutdown does not mean that everything shuts down. The law recognizes that certain government functions are so essential to public safety, national security, and constitutional obligations that they must continue even without current appropriations. These are activities deemed necessary to protect life and property. Federal employees working in these accepted categories remain on the job, though they work without knowing when their next paycheck will arrive. Meanwhile, employees in non-accepted positions are furloughed, meaning they are temporarily sent home without pay until funding is restored. So what actually continues during a shutdown? The list includes some of the most critical functions of government. Social Security checks continue to go out to retirees and disabled Americans. Medicare continues processing claims and providing health care coverage to elderly citizens. These are mandatory spending programs with their own funding streams, largely insulated from annual appropriations battles. Active military operations continue worldwide, with troops remaining at their posts and combat operations, proceeding without interruption. The men and women defending the nation in uniform keep working, though like other accepted employees, they face uncertainty about when they'll be paid. Air traffic controllers remain in towers across the country, guiding aircraft safely through the skies. TSA agents continue screening passengers at airports, maintaining aviation security even as the shutdown drags on. Emergency response capabilities through agencies like FEMA remain operational, ensuring that the government can respond to natural disasters, terrorist incidents, and other crises that don't pause for political gridlock. Federal prisons continue operating, with correctional officers maintaining security and custody of inmates. Border security operations continue, with Border Patrol agents still patrolling the southern and northern borders. But vast swathes of federal activity grind to a halt or slow dramatically. National parks and monuments close to visitors, disappointing tourists who planned vacations months in advance, and devastating local communities that depend on park tourism for their economic survival. Federal grant programs that support state and local governments, non-profits, and research institutions see their funding streams interrupted. This can affect everything from scientific research to community development projects to educational programs. Passport and visa processing slows to a crawl or stops entirely, stranding Americans abroad who need travel documents and preventing foreign visitors from entering the country for business, tourism, or family visits. Support programs that help state and local governments with various initiatives face disruption, creating cascading effects through layers of government and into communities nationwide. Most visibly and painfully, hundreds of thousands of federal workers are furloughed without pay, creating immediate financial hardship for families across the country. While shutdowns have become an unfortunately regular feature of American governance, each one emerges from its own unique political and policy context. Understanding those specifics helps us grasp not just what's happening, but why it matters. Some Americans watching this crisis unfold may remember the record-breaking shutdown of late 2023 and early 2024, which stretched across an agonizing 43 days and furloughed approximately 900,000 federal workers. That shutdown, the longest in American history, centered primarily on disputes over healthcare subsidies, border wall funding, and broader partisan budget priorities. It became a test of political will, with both parties convinced they could outlast the other and force capitulation through public pressure and economic pain. This current shutdown emerges from a different dynamic. The central conflict is narrower but deeper, focused specifically on immigration enforcement reforms, rather than sweeping budget disagreements. Democrats are not simply objecting to spending levels or demanding funding for particular programs. They are insisting on structural changes to how federal immigration authorities operate, changes that Republicans view as fundamental threats to law enforcement effectiveness. This means the policy stakes for lawmakers are substantially different and arguably more complex. They are not negotiating over dollar amounts or debating whether to fund a border barrier. They are grappling with deeper questions. What level of oversight should govern immigration enforcement? How do we balance civil liberties concerns with security imperatives? What role should judicial warrants play in immigration raids? Should federal agents be subject to the same transparency measures, like body cameras, that many local police departments have adopted? These are not questions that lend themselves to easy compromise. You cannot split the difference on whether agents must wear body cameras. A judicial warrant requirement either exists or it doesn't. The binary nature of many of these policy demands makes negotiation more difficult, even as both sides claim they want to reach a deal. Another crucial difference: the scope of the current shutdown is more limited than the 2023-2024 crisis. Most federal agencies are operating normally thanks to the Senate's bipartisan funding package. Only specific departments lack full appropriations, creating a partial rather than comprehensive shutdown. This could make it easier to resolve quickly, since reopening the government does not require agreement on funding for literally every federal function. But it also means the pressure to act may be less intense, potentially allowing the standoff to linger longer than it otherwise might. Perhaps most significantly, this shutdown illustrates how immigration has become the third rail of American politics, capable of derailing even routine governance. Immigration enforcement reforms have become such a politically charged issue that they can prevent Congress from performing its most basic constitutional duty: funding the government. Even when lawmakers agree on 90% of the budget, that remaining 10% tied to immigration policy can grind everything to a halt. This reality suggests that even if the current shutdown is resolved this week, the underlying disagreements are almost certain to resurface. Immigration enforcement will remain a flashpoint, and future budget negotiations will continue to get entangled with these fundamental policy disputes. The shutdown may end, but the conditions that created it will persist. As we examine the current state of affairs, it's important to acknowledge that this is a rapidly evolving situation. What is true at this moment may change within hours as negotiations continue and political pressures mount. The House of Representatives is currently preparing for what could be a decisive vote to reopen key areas of federal funding and bring this shutdown to an end. Leadership is working to assemble the necessary votes, but the path forward remains uncertain and complicated by internal resistance from conservative members who believe the party is conceding too much ground on DHS provisions. Speaker Mike Johnson has gone on record stating that the shutdown could be concluded by Tuesday, expressing optimism that a deal is within reach. However, his assurances have been met with skepticism from members of his own caucus who want stronger immigration enforcement provisions, as well as from Democrats who remain committed to their reform demands. The Democratic position has not softened. They continue to insist on major immigration enforcement reforms in exchange for their votes on any DHS funding package. Senate Democrats, who have more leverage given their majority in that chamber, have indicated they are willing to let the shutdown continue if that's what it takes to secure meaningful policy changes. They argue that this is not mere political posturing, but rather a necessary stand for civil liberties and oversight. Republicans counter that Democrats are the ones prolonging the crisis by attaching controversial policy riders to what should be straightforward funding legislation. They point out that the Senate has already passed a bipartisan package and argue that the House should simply approve it and move on, leaving immigration policy debates for separate legislation. Meanwhile, as these political chess moves play out, essential federal services continue to operate. But the human cost accumulates. Non-essential federal workers face the prospect of furloughs or working without immediate compensation. Contract workers, who often lack the back pay guarantees that federal employees eventually receive, face even more precarious circumstances. Federal operations continue in a state of partial function. The government has not ground to a complete halt, but neither is it operating at full capacity. This liminal state creates its own problems: reduced efficiency, deferred maintenance, postponed projects, and mounting uncertainty. In other words, federal operations continue in part. Essential services remain operational, but the broader political conflict is still very real, very unresolved, and potentially quite prolonged. It's easy, when discussing government shutdowns, to get lost in the procedural details, the political maneuvering, and the constitutional questions. But behind every shutdown are real people facing real consequences that extend far beyond the corridors of power in Washington. The most immediate and visible impact falls on federal employees. The federal workforce comprises roughly 2.1 million civilian employees spread across the entire country and around the world. These are not faceless bureaucrats, but teachers at Department of Defense schools, scientists at the National Institutes of Health, food safety inspectors at the FDA, park rangers at Yellowstone, diplomats at embassies abroad, and administrative staff processing veterans' benefits. During a shutdown, many of these workers face an impossible choice: continue working without knowing when they'll be paid, or get furloughed and sent home with no income at all. For workers designated as essential, there is no choice. They must report to work, performing duties deemed critical to public safety or national security, while their paychecks stop coming. The financial strain this creates cannot be overstated. Federal employees, like all Americans, have mortgages or rent to pay, car payments to make, groceries to buy, and children to feed. A missed paycheck can mean choosing between paying the electric bill or buying prescription medications. It can mean pulling kids out of after-school programs or missing a mortgage payment that damages a credit score built up over years. These are not highly compensated executives with large savings cushions. The median federal employee salary is around $87,000 annually, and many workers earn considerably less. They are solidly middle class, often with families depending on that steady government paycheck. When that paycheck doesn't arrive, the impact is immediate and severe. The psychological toll is equally significant. Federal workers describe the stress and anxiety of not knowing how long the shutdown will last, whether they'll be able to meet their financial obligations, and whether their work is even valued by the government that employs them. Many report feeling like pawns in a political game they have no power to influence. But the impact extends far beyond federal employees themselves. Millions of Americans who don't work for the government may still feel indirect effects that disrupt their lives and livelihoods. Small businesses that depend on federal contracts or serve federal facilities see their revenue streams dry up overnight. A restaurant near a federal office building loses its lunchtime rush. A janitorial company that cleans government buildings sees its workforce idled. These cascading effects ripple through communities, particularly in areas with large federal presences. Research institutions and universities that rely on federal grants for ongoing scientific work face disruptions that can set important research back months or even years. Clinical trials may be paused, critical experiments may fail, because researchers cannot access federal facilities or equipment. Graduate students working on federally funded projects face uncertainty about their funding and their academic futures. Americans seeking federal services encounter delays and frustrations. Someone trying to obtain a passport for an upcoming international trip may find processing has stopped. A veteran seeking benefits determination faces longer waits. A small business owner applying for an SBA loan sees the application process freeze. State and local governments that depend on federal grants to support various programs suddenly face budget uncertainties of their own. A city transportation department waiting for federal highway funds may have to delay infrastructure projects. A state health department expecting federal support for a public health initiative may have to scale back programs or dip into reserve funds. Communities near national parks watch as tourism evaporates virtually overnight. Hotel owners, restaurant operators, tour guides, and countless other small businesses that depend on park visitors face devastating revenue losses. During the 2018 to 2019 shutdown, communities near popular parks reported economic impacts in the millions of dollars from just a few weeks of closure. Native American tribes that depend on federal services and funding for health care, education, and social services face particular hardship. Many tribal governments operate under agreements that assume consistent federal support, and shutdowns can disrupt everything from health clinics to schools. These human costs accumulate day by day, creating hardship that persists even after funding is restored. Damage to credit scores, depleted savings accounts, deferred medical care, educational disruptions. These consequences don't disappear the moment Congress passes a funding bill. If government shutdowns are so disruptive, so costly, and so damaging to public trust, why do they keep happening? The answer reveals deep structural and cultural problems in how American government functions in the 21st century. The formal budget process, as designed, requires Congress to pass 12 separate appropriations bills each fiscal year. These bills, which together fund the entire federal government, are supposed to move through both chambers well before the October 1st start of the new fiscal year. Committees hold hearings, debate amendments, reconcile differences between House and Senate versions, and ultimately send completed legislation to the President for signature. This process, often called regular order, was designed to ensure careful deliberation, thorough oversight, and democratic accountability. It assumed a degree of cooperation, shared purpose, and institutional respect between the legislative and executive branches, and between the two political parties. That assumption no longer holds. Regular order has essentially collapsed as a functioning process. Congress routinely fails to pass appropriations bills on time, instead relying on a patchwork of continuing resolutions that fund the government at previous levels for weeks or months at a time. When even continuing resolutions cannot win approval, shutdowns result. Several factors have contributed to this breakdown. First and most fundamental is the intense political polarization that now characterizes American politics. The ideological distance between the two parties has grown dramatically over recent decades, while the number of genuinely moderate or crossover lawmakers has dwindled. This makes compromise more difficult and increases the stakes of budget fights. Second, the rise of what scholars call minority veto points has given small factions outsized power to block legislation. In the Senate, the routine use of the filibuster requires 60 votes to move most legislation, giving the minority party significant leverage. In the House, narrow majorities mean that relatively small groups of ideological lawmakers can threaten to withhold support unless their demands are met. Third, there has been a fundamental shift in how lawmakers view shutdown threats. What was once considered a last resort, a sign of governance failure to be avoided at almost any cost, has increasingly become seen as a legitimate tactical weapon. Some lawmakers and political factions now openly embrace shutdown threats as a way to force concessions on unrelated policy disputes. Fourth, the current shutdown illustrates how single-issue conflicts can paralyze the entire budget process. Immigration has become such an intensely polarizing issue that disagreements over immigration enforcement can prevent agreement on anything else. When every spending bill becomes a potential vehicle for immigration policy riders, and when those riders become non-negotiable demands, the regular appropriations process becomes virtually impossible. Fifth, there are few political costs for prolonged shutdowns compared to past eras. Public opinion polling generally shows that most Americans disapprove of shutdowns and tend to blame the party perceived as most intransigent. But in today's highly polarized environment, where most House districts and many Senate seats are safely Republican or Democratic, individual lawmakers often face more pressure from their ideological base to stand firm than from swing voters to compromise. Governance experts increasingly describe shutdowns not as occasional mistakes or exceptions to normal functioning, but as symptoms of deeper procedural and political pathologies in the American system. The budget process is broken, they argue, not because of temporary dysfunction, but because of structural changes in how Congress operates and how parties compete. Some scholars have proposed reforms, automatic continuing resolutions that would prevent shutdowns, even when appropriations bills stall. Binding arbitration for budget disputes, electoral reforms to reduce polarization, or even constitutional amendments to change how federal funding works. But these proposals face their own political obstacles and may be unworkable given the current environment. The harder truth is that shutdowns have become a recurring feature of American governance, not aberrations from it. Until the underlying dynamics change, the polarization, the tactical use of brinksmanship, the collapse of regular order, the weaponization of must-pass legislation, we can expect this cycle to continue. So where do we go from here? What can Americans expect in the coming days and weeks as this latest chapter in the recurring shutdown saga unfolds? In the short term, the most likely scenario is that lawmakers will find a way to pass the spending package that has already been approved in the Senate. If the House follows suit, funding would be restored to the affected departments, and the shutdown would officially end. Speaker Johnson's prediction of a Tuesday resolution could prove accurate if negotiations yield a face-saving compromise that gives both sides something to claim as a victory. One possible compromise path involves Democrats accepting the short-term DHS funding extension without all their desired reforms in exchange for Republican commitments to address some reform priorities in separate legislation or through oversight mechanisms. This would allow both sides to declare partial victory. Democrats could claim they secured a path forward on immigration enforcement reforms, while Republicans could argue they prevented harmful restrictions on federal law enforcement authority. Another scenario involves a longer continuing resolution that buys more negotiating time without resolving the underlying disputes. This kicks the can down the road, perhaps into March or April, giving lawmakers more time to hammer out details on immigration enforcement while preventing an immediate crisis. However, there is also a real possibility that the shutdown drags on longer than anyone currently anticipates. If both sides calculate that they have more to gain politically by holding firm than by compromising, if neither party believes they will ultimately bear the blame for the impasse, the standoff could persist for days or even weeks. What happens in the medium to long term is even less certain. Even if this particular shutdown ends quickly, the fundamental disagreements over immigration enforcement and DHS reform are certain to resurface. The 2-week funding extension for DHS means this entire fight could replay itself in less than a month, potentially triggering another shutdown cycle. These recurring battles over immigration policy and federal funding will likely continue to shape the legislative landscape throughout 2026. How lawmakers handle these disputes could have significant electoral consequences as the 2026 midterm elections approach. Both parties will be watching public opinion carefully. If polls show voters overwhelmingly blaming one party for the shutdown and its consequences, that party will face pressure to compromise to avoid electoral damage. Conversely, if voters are divided or seem relatively indifferent, both parties may feel empowered to maintain their positions. Swing districts and competitive Senate races will be particularly sensitive to shutdown politics. A House member in a purple district who faces a tough re-election campaign may break with their party leadership if they believe the shutdown is hurting their electoral prospects. Similarly, Senators in battleground states may feel pressure to broker compromises to show voters they can work across party lines. The shutdown also shapes the broader policy agenda for the year. Time and political capital spent fighting over appropriations is time not spent on other legislative priorities. Major policy initiatives may get delayed or abandoned as leaders focus on simply keeping the government open. For federal employees and the Americans who depend on federal services, the uncertainty continues. Even when this shutdown ends, the prospect of future shutdowns looms. Workers may begin keeping larger emergency savings, knowing they could face furloughs again. Contractors may think twice about taking on federal work given the instability. The long-term damage to federal workforce morale and recruitment should not be underestimated. International observers and allies are watching as well. America's inability to perform basic governance functions, its recurring budget crises and shutdown cycles, raises questions about political stability and institutional capacity. In an era of great power competition, when American leadership is challenged by rivals pointing to democratic dysfunction, these shutdowns carry implications beyond domestic policy. Government shutdowns are often portrayed as inside the Beltway political theater, Washington dysfunction that doesn't really matter to ordinary Americans. But this framing misses something crucial. Shutdowns are both symptoms and causes of deeper challenges facing American democracy. They are symptoms of a political system increasingly unable to perform its most basic constitutional functions. The power to fund the government, to appropriate money for federal operations, is perhaps the most fundamental power that the Constitution grants to Congress. If lawmakers cannot consistently exercise that power without triggering governance crises, it suggests serious institutional breakdown. Shutdowns also contribute to declining public trust in government institutions. When Americans watch their government repeatedly fail to keep itself open, when they see politicians seemingly more interested in political point scoring than problem solving, when essential services are disrupted over partisan disputes, cynicism deepens, and that cynicism makes future cooperation even harder, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of dysfunction. The normalization of shutdowns may be the most concerning trend of all. Each shutdown makes the next one more politically acceptable, more tactically viable as a negotiating tool. What was once considered a sign of governance failure becomes just another move in the political playbook. This normalization erodes the shared commitment to keeping the government functioning that once constrained political conflict. There are also economic costs that extend beyond the immediate impact on federal workers. Rating agencies watch shutdown dynamics carefully when assessing American creditworthiness. Business investment and economic planning become more difficult when the basic stability of government operations cannot be assumed. The longer-term competitiveness of the American economy may be affected by repeated demonstrations of political dysfunction. Perhaps most fundamentally, shutdowns raise questions about whether the American political system, designed in the 18th century for a very different society and polity, can adapt to 21st century challenges. The checks and balances that the founders created to prevent tyranny may also create multiple veto points that make coherent governance nearly impossible in an era of deep polarization. Other democracies have parliamentary systems where governments that cannot pass budgets fall and new elections are called. The American system has no such mechanism. A president serves their full term, regardless of whether they can work effectively with Congress. Lawmakers face no immediate electoral consequences for shutdown brinksmanship. The institutional incentives may actually favor confrontation over compromise in many cases. These are not easy problems to solve, and they admit of no simple fixes. But acknowledging their existence, understanding their implications, and maintaining pressure on elected officials to find better ways forward remains essential. Democracy requires functional institutions, and functional institutions require leaders willing to make them work, even when cooperation is politically difficult. As we conclude this examination of the latest government shutdown crisis, one truth stands out with stark clarity. The United States government running out of money is not merely an abstract budget fight playing out in congressional hearing rooms and cable news studios. It is a real political showdown with real economic consequences and profound social implications. While essential functions continue to operate, ensuring that the most critical government services remain available, the risk of extended disruption looms large. Federal workers face the anxiety of uncertain paychecks. Communities dependent on federal facilities and services face economic hardship. Americans planning trips to national parks, applying for passports, or depending on federal programs encounter delays and disruptions. The political blowback from this shutdown will reverberate through the coming months and into the 2026 election cycle. How voters assign blame, which party they hold responsible for the dysfunction, and whether they punish shutdown politics at the ballot box will shape not just electoral outcomes, but the incentive structure for future budget negotiations. Even when this particular shutdown ends, as it eventually will, the underlying disagreements that created it will remain. The dispute over immigration enforcement reforms, the broader questions about federal law enforcement authority, and civil liberties protections, the fundamental tension between security imperatives and constitutional constraints. None of these will be resolved by a simple appropriations bill. These deeper conflicts will continue to shape legislation, influence policy debates, and potentially trigger future shutdowns throughout this year and beyond. The 2-week DHS funding extension that may emerge from current negotiations merely postpones the reckoning, setting the stage for another showdown in the near future. What happens next depends not just on votes counted in the House and Senate chambers, not just on backroom negotiations between party leaders, not just on public opinion polling and electoral calculations. It depends on whether enough lawmakers can summon the political will to find common ground in a deeply, perhaps irreconcilably divided Washington. That common ground has become increasingly elusive as polarization has deepened, as primary electorates have pulled both parties toward their ideological poles, as gerrymandering has created safe seats where compromise is punished rather than rewarded, and as the entire structure of political incentives has shifted to favor confrontation over cooperation. For the millions of Americans whose lives are directly affected by this shutdown, for the federal workers wondering when their next paycheck will arrive, for the communities watching their economic lifelines disrupted, for the citizens who simply expect their government to function, the waiting continues. The machinery of American democracy has seized up once again, caught between competing visions of how the nation should address immigration enforcement, competing political calculations about electoral advantage, and competing theories about whether compromise represents pragmatism or capitulation. In the coming hours and days, lawmakers will make choices that determine not just when federal funding is restored, but how future budget battles will be fought. Will this shutdown teach that brinksmanship works, encouraging more aggressive tactics in future negotiations? Or will the political costs prove high enough to restore some measure of the restraint that once characterized budget negotiations? The answers to these questions will shape American governance for years to come. They will influence whether shutdowns remain a regular feature of political life or return to being rare exceptions. They will determine whether the budget process can be restored to something resembling functionality, or whether we have entered a new era of permanent crisis governance. For now, the nation waits. Federal employees check their bank accounts and worry about making rent. Park rangers put up closure signs. Government contractors halt work and send employees home. Research projects pause, services slow or stop. And in Washington, behind closed doors and in public statements, in committee rooms and leadership offices, in the House chamber and the Senate floor, lawmakers continue the difficult, frustrating, essential work of trying to govern a deeply divided nation. This story is still unfolding. The next chapter could be written in hours, or it could take days or weeks. But one thing is certain. The outcome of this shutdown will matter, not just for the immediate question of when federal funding resumes, but for what it reveals about the state of American democracy and the capacity of its institutions to meet the challenges of governing in our polarized age. Stay tuned. The wait continues, and with it, the hope that somewhere in the gap between partisan entrenchment and political calculation, there remains enough space for the compromises that functioning governance requires.